So greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sylvia Hahn, as you can see, and I'm co-chair of the Corporate Board Education Committee. Welcome you on behalf of the Boston Club's Corporate Board Committee. It's our pleasure to co-host this event today with ACG, the Association for Corporate Growth's Boston chapter, and welcome to our ACG members attending today. This program tonight is kicking off a series focused on trends in corporate board competencies driven by social, governance, and technological change, topics that were recently highlighted by our Boston Club Director Circle of Experienced Board Directors. Our corporate board education programming in 2022 will follow up today's discussion with dedicated programming on each competency, including data analytics, cybersecurity, ESG, and other topics that you'll hear about today. So please keep an eye on our events calendar throughout the year. Many thanks to Karen Goltz, our distinguished moderator, our amazing panelists, Jennifer Lloyd, Elizabeth Mora, Jill Smith, and Roberta Sidney, and our ACG partners, including Executive Director Christy Dancause and ACG board member Daniela Messina, who has a message from ACG.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. Hi, everyone, I'm Daniela. As Sylvia mentioned, I serve on the board of ACG Boston, and I co-chair our Women's Connection Committee, and I also serve on the Corporate Board Committee for the Boston Club. A few words about ACG for those of you who are not familiar with our organization. We are the premier M&A deal-making community with about 59 chapters worldwide. We have a network of about 100,000 middle market professionals and about 15,000 members globally who invest, own, and advise growing companies. So ACG's mission is to really drive middle market growth. The Boston chapter represents about the M&A deal community across New England. So we provide opportunities to build and maintain strong networks, peers, relationships, facilitating education and conversations around relevant industry topics like this evening. Our Boston chapter hosts about 40 in-person and virtual events each year. We have about 500 local members. We are thrilled about this event tonight and the collaboration with the Boston Club, as we have great synergies to help advance women and promote professional women in the M&A and across various industries. So looking forward to a lively discussion this evening. And I'm going to turn it over next to our wonderful moderator, Karen Goltz. But a few words about Karen. Karen is a board member of Analog Devices, Aspen Technology, and Ocean Holdings, Exitech. She is also a senior advisor to the Boston Consulting Group's Audit and Risk Committee. And Karen is also an NACD Board Leadership Fellow and was named by Women Inc. magazine as a most influential corporate director. She also serves as the member of the Boston Club's Director Circle, and we're happy to have her and introduce her as our moderator this evening. Karen?
Thank you so much, Daniela. And I want to welcome everyone for participating in today's session. It's great to see so many familiar faces and familiar names. And I look forward to the day when we can all be together in person, hopefully sometime soon, safely. We have got, Sylvia and Daniela already mentioned the names of our four incredibly talented directors who are going to share this evening their stories and what they are seeing in the board landscape. And they're coming from different perspectives. You're going to see how each is very unique. But I think this panel was built this way specifically to allow for a variety of perspectives and so forth. So you know that our panelists are Beth Mora, Jen Lloyd, Jill Smith, and Roberta Sidney. And we're going to try to unpack tonight some of the emerging board competencies that are needed into today's modern boardroom and into next generation modern boardroom. So that's sort of our goal tonight. We are very anxious for your questions. So I think Sylvia told me it was okay. They can put questions in the chat, and I will be trying to monitor that chat, as will probably Sylvia will be helping me. We will start with a few questions and so forth. But first, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves a little bit briefly, and then to answer one of the questions which was given to us in advance of this session. And that question was, as you reflect on the first board you joined, can you share what steps you took to get board ready? And that'll help. This question, together with their backgrounds, will help us get us into the dialogue more specifically about competencies. So I'm going to ask Beth to start first. Thank you, Beth.
Thanks, Karen. I'm Beth Mora. I've been doing corporate board work for about 10 years. Currently, I'm on 2 public company boards, MKS Instruments in Andover and Inogen, which is a portable oxygen device company in Santa Barbara, California. I was chair of a public company that got overtaken by activists in March of 20 called GCP Applied Technologies. So that was interesting. But I thought this was a really good question. So thanks for asking it. One thing that I do is I look carefully, in addition to the background of the company, the background of the people on the board. So we often talk about the intangible fit issue. How do we get there? What are we looking for? So for me, one way that I assess this is by looking at the background. Where do people go to school? Where do people grow up? There's so much in the internet now, but where was their first job? What are their interests? What about nonprofit? And when there are those pauses in the conversation, one can always pivot to something that is a common bond. The moment I say that I'm from Boston, what do you think everybody wants to talk to me about? The Patriots and Tom Brady. You know, I'm not particularly interested in either one of those subjects, but I make sure that I know at least a little bit of what's going on. And I have some stories to share, as Tom and Giselle there lived in Brookline. So I think really taking the time to see where you can meet people on, I wouldn't say a really personal level, but some place of connection that will give you a sense of how personable, affable, congenial this group is going to be or not. That's what I have.
Great, thanks, Beth. Jen, I'm going to ask you next.
Okay, so my name is Jen Lloyd. I'm a board member of Power Integrations, and I'm a business leader at Analog Devices, which is a Massachusetts-based semiconductor company, though I have been located in Santa Clara now for a little while. And I've always been interested in board service as a path for personal growth. So as I started my board journey, I really did that by taking on an advising position to the Dean of Engineering at WPI, John McNeil. So this is obviously very different from serving on a public company board. But in the review process for that position, I had to pull out my dusty old resume and update it. And it really got me thinking about, you know, how to state my value proposition from being a technologist. That's really my background. In other words, like, here are all the patents and papers that I've done, to here's what I can really bring to a board where the needs are more at an enterprise level. So that was really kind of my first step. And then in my work at ADI, I had the good fortune to have some board roles on companies we were investing in. So these were more non-voting kind of board seats, but I got a lot of exposure to how boards work. And it still meant, you know, attending and providing inputs to the CEO. And that experience, I think, did lead me to really think hard about what I would want to see in a board that I wanted to participate in. So ultimately, my outside ADI network gave me a connection to this company, Power Integrations. And having seen boards in action, I probably interviewed the board as much as they interviewed me, you know, looking for that good mutual fit of my skills and what their needs were. And in April of this year, I joined that board and I'm serving on their audit committee. So that's a brief intro.
Thanks, Jen. So Jill, how about your story? and who you
Super.
are.
Thank you, Karen. It was great to hear Beth's and Jen's entree into the board world as well. So, you know, I spent 20 years as CEO, and I've been 10 years in what I would call a sort of a full-time non-exec capacity. And when I was stepping down from my last stint, I was very focused on this is what I wanted to do. And there are really two parallel paths I took. One is in Europe, there still are higher quotas for women. And so I knew I wanted to play where the probability was the highest. And so targeted very explicitly European boards. And I know several other folks have done the same thing. Downside is there's no equity. So the comp isn't the same, but there has historically been a very strong pathway for women in particular onto European boards. And so I reached out to headhunters, really focused on my international experience, and that landed me on the board of Elster, which is a private equity but publicly listed company. And in parallel, absolutely to Beth's point, it's about really researching people and or leveraging people you know. And so on the various conference circuits, the industry that I'm in targeted companies that were not competitors to my former company, and went straight to the CEO or non-gov chair or chair. And lo and behold, I landed on the board of Hexagon, which is also a European company based on my relationship with the CEO. So get focused, get targeted, and it's amazing what you can surface when you go narrowly initially to launch the process.
Thanks so much, Jill. Well, you can already see how these paths were quite different just from three people. So I think that's great. And Roberta, how about you winding up this segment with your background and your journey?
Sure. So it's great to be here. I'm a longtime Boston Club member, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone today. And if you don't hear me, let me know, because sometimes this computer gives me a little trouble. So I, like Jill, have also gone through the path of CEO first to then board service. So my background is financial services, and then starting my own real estate development company that I ran for about 20 years. And then decided that it was time to maybe harvest some of those buildings. If I'd known that COVID was coming, I could have harvested more, but whatever, hindsight is 20/20. And so about 2015 was when I started to get off the path of day-to-day operations full-time and really begin what I call my portfolio career in being an independent board director. For me, I would say a couple things about my path. One is I believe in the Trinity, which is LinkedIn, your board bio, and resume. And if you don't have those things now, you need them, and you need them to sing. You need to do everything that people on the panel have already said about translating your work and life experience into how you would add value to a board. You don't want to look operational. It can't be just a resume. I did this, I did that. I'm wonderful, because then you look like someone looking for a job, or someone who's going to tell someone or micromanage the company, and the CEO is not gonna appreciate that. So that's the first thing that I would say. And then the second, and I'll sort of echo something that Jill said, which is really it's all about networking. And the way that I got onto my first board, I'll give you the path. So I, having run a private company and having set up my own board, I'm very interested in board governance. And so I went to an event in Chicago called the Private Company Governance Summit. This is back in, I guess, maybe 2015 or 16. And I thought that it was a really great organization. I learned something about, I already knew about the National Association of Corporate Directors, but I didn't know anything about the Private Directors Association. So I reached out to somebody in Chicago, and I said, geez, there really should be something like that here in New England and in Boston. And she said, oh, you should talk to so-and-so. Well, it happened to be someone I already knew through NACD. So I reached out to her. So ping pong, follow this. And then when I reached out to her, she said, oh, no, it's not me. It's this other guy. Let me introduce you to him. And so this other gentleman happens to be a family business consultant. And so in the process of having a conversation about the PDA, he said, well, let me just get to know you. And in my process of telling him my elevator pitch, my value add, my unique proposition, if you will, He said, well, geez, would you be interested in a board seat in Long Island City with this company? And so that was how my introduction went. So if you had told me by going to a conference, I was going to meet this person and meet, that's the process for many people. It is not straight ahead. There's not a yellow pages where there's a listing of every board seat available in the country and you can kind of look at, or across the world. And in Jill's case, it's not just this country. So that's my admonition to everyone who's on the call today, is think about who you are, where you add value, and then network strategically with people in the space where you are straight down the fairway, to use a golf term as opposed to a football term. So for me, it's financial services and it's real estate. So that's what I've done. And I really look forward to all of the questions today. And thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Roberta. As I recently counseled someone that I used to work with, you don't apply for a board position. They apply for you, more or less. So great. So we're gonna jump into questions. I am watching the chat. So if anybody has any questions, please shoot them in there. So Jen, I'm going to start with you and ask you a question. You have sort of a less traditional board background, that being you weren't a sitting CEO or CFO, technologist, as you said. So how did you position that a little more specifically? And also, I'm just going to bring in, which I didn't in advance tell you, I forgot to tell you this part.
No problem.
You're amongst the panelists, you would be sort of on the younger age-wise, or earlier in your career to go on to a board. So I'd like you to comment a little bit about that, if you can. And what kind of advice do you have for others that are, participating today?
Sure.
That might have less traditional backgrounds, or backgrounds that, again, they're not CEOs, they're not CFOs, maybe they're not the COO, about how to go about looking or finding a board seat, and how they can best position themselves. That's a long question, but I know you can handle it.
Okay, let me try to unpack that. So the first thing in terms of positioning myself, I mean, for sure, I have a background as a technologist, but I've also run businesses. And I do think that for board positions, there has to be some level of financial qualification. So for the public company board that I currently sit on, they were looking for somebody that had a profile like me, where I had run a P&L of a reasonable sized business, but also had a strong technology and customer background. That what they were really looking for was somebody that had kind of global customer and market experience, but also had a strong enough technology background to, now it isn't in the specific technology, obviously, or there'd be a conflict with my current role, but with enough of that capability to really dig in on the technology side and be able to advise in terms of maybe new market and customer focus areas for the company. So I would say that, I've always positioned myself as having that good technology background with the financial and P&L experience. And I can talk a little bit about, how one might kind of gain that experience if they don't have it. So, but let me, okay, so the next question was related to kind of my age on the board. I don't actually believe that they were specifically looking for a specific age range or anything. And by the way, I'm not really that young, but
comparatively speaking.
but I think one thing that that does bring with it is that I am currently employed. And what that means is two things. One, conflicts could arise. In fact, the company I'm on the board for and my own company are both semiconductor companies. So that is something that, both I and the CEO and the board has to watch out for, is when you have somebody on the board who's employed at another company, is watching out for that. But the positive that I think it really brings with it is that I currently run a large global organization of 700 engineers. And so even through the last year and managing the COVID situation, there's a lot of experience that I can now bring in terms of perspective that turned out to be very useful. And I'm current with business practices and so on. So I think that that's something that maybe the age can bring. And also just, like as was talked about, network. I think by having a diversity of ages, genders, and so on boards, you expand the network of that board, right, as well as the people on the board. In terms of advice, what I would say is, I talked about expertise, bringing your expertise to the table. And in my case, I brought technology expertise and some financial expertise, but actually, probably shouldn't call it financial expertise. I'll say some P&L experience, but I would advise people to really look for ways that you can, if you're currently at a company, employed at a company, look for ways that you can get involved in enterprise level projects. So whether that be, volunteering to be part of, say, an integration work stream if your company does a merger or acquisition, getting involved in governance related, like something that I did was I got involved in Analog Devices preparing for the issuance of a green bond, which relates to ESG. And getting that kind of experience can bring, because I think over the next little while, we're going to talk about some of the new things that boards are worried about, and experience that you can bring in areas like ESG or new technologies, I think can be really helpful. So I think building your expertise, and there are universities and firms that run really good programs that focus on specific areas, like specific technology areas like cybersecurity, or building your business acumen for board serviceship. So that is out there. We talked about networking quite a bit. And again, I think that's super important, is participating in the industry that you're in, building your network that way. Like I accept speaking opportunities and participate in a lot of IEEE technology events to help with that. And I think we've covered on some of the other ones that I would advise, which is like, I think that it took me that little journey that I described to understand how to build a brand and a board profile. And I think getting with the program on that is pretty key. And I'll just make a plug for the Mass TLC Technology Leadership Council was really helpful with some of their programming in that area.
Thanks very much, Jen. That's great. A lot of good tips in there. So Jill, I'm going to turn to you. And, you are an experienced and serial board member and board chair. So tell us how you think about the mix of skills and competencies needed to be represented on boards today, especially as you would look at it as a board chair. And then how have you seen that change? Because you've been on boards for 10 plus years. So how have you seen that change over the last, over that 10-year period?
Well, Carol, I'm disappointed you didn't comment on my youth. But once I get over that, we can speak about my experience.
I'm never going to live this down. I just want everybody to know.
So, certainly the experience that I have to share, first of all, comes from MidCap. That is the sort of the sector in which I play. And in the context of, a reference to chair, I think note to self for the folks here is that the nom and gov chair is sometimes the most important influencer of where a board or how a board evolves in terms of its refresh and its skills. With regard to those new skills, lest there's any doubt as to whether there really are new opportunities that perhaps yesterday would not have existed for first-time directors and or people that haven't been CEOs, the data demonstrates that there is a significant step up in first-time CEOs and a significant step up in people who are not CEOs taking those first-time positions. And that starts, quite frankly, because where 10 years ago, a board was comprised substantially of people that got along. And, that was a little bit of a self-fulfilling sort of expectation. What we have now is every single company is facing issues that they've never seen before. As Sylvia highlighted at the beginning, you know, tech and cyber. There is not a company that's not concerned about that. So if you have those skills, whether it's a headline requirement or not, it's something to pitch. Strategy and transformation, changes in business model. If you have participated in, led, been part of a team to do, been part of an industry that has been involved in that, absolutely essential. Again, probably not a board that's not talking about some level of transformation. Innovation and organic growth. You've got a whole lot of M&A, that goes without saying, but companies really trying to figure out how to rev the growth machine. If you have been in product, you've been in the front line, you've actually helped to change the organic growth trajectory, that's what people that may not know they need a director will hear when you lead with it. And certainly once you're a part of a board search process, those are some of the core skills that unequivocally are being sought after. It goes without saying, diversity is very large, and 10 years ago, women were the number 1 and 2 and 3 requirements. Now it's very much diversity, of which women is a part, but certainly looking to really leverage our role as women and or diverse candidates is absolutely key. So there is change. For the first time, we've got pull through from shareholders to diversify boards, not just in terms of our profile, our ethnic or gender profile, but also experience. And for the first time, we're being asked to disclose it. So boards really have to live up to that expectation. So Karen, to your point around, you know, is there an opportunity for first time and all those new skills? Unequivocally really teeing off of the experiences you've had that are aligned with the challenges of boards that may have been in place for 10 years, and they're looking for fresh insight, diverse views. I will say that, you know, sort of a second category of what a board's looking for is, whereas fit and getting along used to be a criteria, different points of view are increasingly essential. So there might have been a time where interviewing for a board position was about getting along. Go in with a point of view. Make an observation about the profile of their board. Make an observation about what you heard on the latest earnings call. Make an observation or a pointed question about something that may have been brought up in a proxy battle or otherwise. Be curious, be strong, have a point of view. I'll just finish, Karen, with just sort of what hasn't changed. The reality is, and it's been said here already 15 times, knowing people is still one of the most important advantages. So if you want to get onto a board, figure out who you know around that circle. You know, if you are good and somebody knows you, you're a shoo-in. If you're just good, that may not be both necessary and sufficient.
Thanks, Jill. Before I go to this next question, I just wanted to share Deloitte's Center for Board Effectiveness published some materials recently, and they had sort of the top schedule that had the top criteria for director recruitment. They had executive leadership and finance, which those are always kind of present. But then it went technology, investment, human capital and talent development, cybersecurity, and entrepreneurial. And of course, there's others, but this was just that list. But when you think about human capital, the importance of human capital and talent development, that is so important today. And you know, 5 years ago, I'm not sure chief talent officers or human resource officers were ever looked at for boards, because they weren't viewed as strategic as they are today in the talent war for talent. So that's just some data from Deloitte. So let me, Beth, I'm going to turn to you. And Jill actually started a little bit of the conversation about diversity and inclusion, but I'd like your very unvarnished view about what's really driving the impetus for more diversity and inclusion. This was a question that came in before the session started. You know, is it shareholder pressure, consumer, PR? And if you believe it's any of those sources and those pressures either begin to abate or simmer down, Will boards become less concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And if you have the time and the opportunity, maybe chat a little bit about the NASDAQ guidelines, because some folks may not be as familiar with those.
So let me start with that, if it's okay. So on August 6th in 21, the NASDAQ came out with something called a diversity rule. It's not a law, it's a rule that says that any company traded on the NASDAQ needs to disclose by August 8th, 2022, or their proxy, whichever date is later in 2022, why they don't have a woman and an underrepresented minority on their board. So then, so we say, okay, well, how many don't? So there's a few different numbers rolling around in the press, but Forbes cited that there are 3,000 companies traded on the NASDAQ. 75%, 2,250 companies do not have one woman or one underrepresented minority. Okay, so that sounds like plenty of opportunity. And that's covered by pressure from shareholders, institutional investors. I remember being in Florida 3 years ago with Jackie Maloney, who's the chancellor of UMass Lowell and is the lead director on the MKS board, when Larry Fink came out and said, listen, ESG, diversity and inclusion, sustainability, these are the priorities of BlackRock, and we are going to be looking very carefully. And I read it out of the Times to Jackie, and I said, I wonder what this means. And here we are with the shareholder, the institutional investors putting pressure on the NASDAQ. They've adopted this diversity rule. So I can guarantee you no one wants to be explaining in their proxy why they don't have any women or underrepresented minorities, because we know that there's plenty of supply. Supply is not a problem. So in addition to shareholders, I think also employees. So I would say there's pressure from the top down, but also the bottom up. I mean, look at this pandemic and how Gen Z, Gen Y employs the dearth of talent, the problems in the supply chain. These people are calling the shots now. So when this generation comes in, they want to be able to look up to the boardroom and see people like themselves. Not a group of old white guys, sorry to be so blunt, but they want to see more of a reflection of their customers, their vendors, their colleagues, the world. And then you throw in the incident, the unfortunate incident of George Floyd, and there's this powder keg of social justice. All these elements together have accumulated in really what I think is a tremendous opportunity. So, so that's sort of the short answer. I don't think it's going away. I think it's going to increase. I think there'll be a lot more sustainability requirements. I think those are coming next. If I can just jump on to something Jill and Roberta said with respect to how to think about this. What I always say to people is think of the network and then write 50 names of people you know who are connected somehow to boards. Categorize the list, those people you can call today for help, those people you could write an email to, the next section. And then the last section is you don't know them, but you know somebody who knows them through LinkedIn. And now you have 50 leads, if you will, to go pursue. And as I've said to some of you who are participating today, this is kind of a part-time job. It's an effort, you got to do it. It's not every day, all day, but you can't, it's like one, foot on the gas, foot on the brake, and it's tricky. But the good news is the numbers are in our favor. And, what's hard is to have the conversation with, David, who's 78 years old, who's been on the board for 18 years. David, it's time to go. You've been on for 18 years. You've been terrific. We want to thank you for your service. We need refreshment. We need technology, we need ESG, we need diversity, perspective. Those conversations, I think, are harder to have now because of Zoom and let's wait till like we see him. It's just people don't like conflict and let's just push it down the road. So that's something that I think we have to contend with. But you know, the numbers and the pressures are in our favor.
Thanks, Beth. You're absolutely right. We certainly have significant tailwinds to help us in this, which was not the case, you know, even 10 years ago. And to your point about your 50 people and categorizing them, I also had the mantra that if I talked to somebody, I didn't let them go until they gave me another name of somebody they could introduce me to, and sometimes I'd say, well, give me two. So, but I couldn't always be greedy. So, okay, Roberta, I want to turn to you. Again, you have, you know, a lot of experience, and I want to pick up a little bit more on this diversity. How genuine, when you look at the boards you're on, how genuine do you see the commitment level of your respective boards to diversity and inclusion? And if you have an anecdote or something about how you've seen that bring value into the board, we'd love to hear that as well.
Sure. Well, I'd like to break this into two because I don't think diversity and inclusion are the same, nor do I think they are easy. I think inclusion is a lot harder. So I'll start with diversity. The boards that I'm on really do care about diversity. And as Beth just talked about, more and more there's disclosures around this. And so everybody cares a lot about it. And so what are we doing? We're counting noses, we're counting heads, we're evaluating whether it's say on pay, what are people being paid, we're stratifying it by level, by gender, by underrepresented minorities, and so forth. Really easy to look at the numbers and to evaluate the numbers, whether it's how many we have, how many we're bringing in, and so forth. And people want to do that and are doing that, and those questions are being asked. I think when it comes to inclusion, it's a lot harder. And the reason I think it's a lot harder is it's a lot harder to know whether people feel like they belong, whether they feel like they can be themselves at work. And so there are employee resource groups which have helped with that. In one of my boards, I've been asked to speak to the women's group. And so there are opportunities there for board members to connect with people who are like them, whether it's the gay population or the Black population or some other employee resource group. The other thing we're doing, and I've seen this, is employee surveys. So in one of my boards, the Net Promoter Score, the employee Net Promoter Score is something that we measure, that we monitor, and that we speak about. Super important for us. So that's actually a remote first company. So we can talk more about that later when we get to that, but that's a new challenge, I think, in this hybrid work anywhere world. And the other thing that we look at is are they voting with their feet? This is one way we try to get at a proxy for inclusion. It's like asking, okay, so you've got the faucet open of the bathtub, but you've also got the drain going. So how many are we bringing in? How long are they staying? And which ones are leaving and at what level? Because it's a proxy for how inclusive we are. Because what we see is that we're bringing all of these entry-level people, but they all leave within 6 months or 18 months, what have you. We understand there's a problem there. And again, at the board level, we can be asking, well, what are we doing? Where are we with advancement? Where are we with retention? Where are we with inclusion? Because again, it's trying to understand, to measure. And again, if it hasn't been said here today, you have to measure what matters because that gets people focused. And that will bring me to my last point around this, which is at many of my boards now, we are taking this time, this COVID era time, to rethink our incentive plans and include non-financial metrics, which include things like something on diversity or advancement for underrepresented or the gender mix. And it is super important for us to be looking at that at the board level and to be voting with our feet, and for our executives to understand that this is something that they need to prioritize. And so those are the kinds of things we're doing. I think it's extremely important. I think it bodes well for what we're doing. And I want to go back to something that both Jen and Jill said before I forget it, which is not only is it important to network, and not only is it important to come up with your list the way Beth talked about, but it's important to do what Jen has talked about, which is to speak and to be known. And Jill talked about this as well. So whether it's writing or speaking, these are important ways for us to build our brand as board members. And it's increasingly important for someone to see that there's a body of work, whether it's your writing. I mean, I've written for the NACD Director Magazine or the UK Governance Magazine or Forbes. These are ways that, and I speak for panels like this, and I'm speaking at the NACD Summit on Friday. These are ways for me to increase my visibility. And I encourage everyone on this panel today to think about where is it that you can expand your network and your visibility with sharing what you know and increasing your own visibility. Because again, as Jill said so well, it's terrific if you're an expert, but if no one knows, you're not going to be asked to submit a board bio or be asked for an interview.
Berta, thanks. Jill, I'm going to come back to you, and I want to turn the tide to ESG, and I'll say ESG and climate change. And what do you see as some of the primary drivers for the focus on that? And is it external to the company, internal to the company? Are board members themselves a driver for that? And then maybe picking up a little bit on what Roberta said, are you starting to see ESG metrics making their way into the compensation and measurement of senior executives like the CEO and so forth?
Yeah, super. And it's a great follow-on from the superb conversation on D&I. I think everyone is aware D&I is part of ESG. Sometimes ESG is used as shorthand for climate change and sustainability, but it's governance. It's all the good stuff we've been talking about, board refresh and diversity. It's D&I writ large as part of social. And cyber's also in there as social. And of course it is environmental, which is the E. And exactly as Beth had articulated, is the role of at least two bodies have really driven the impetus. First of all was the roundtable, the business roundtable in 2019, when they declared that corporate responsibility was not just to serve shareholders, but also to value customers, invest in employees, deal fairly with suppliers, and support the communities in which they operate. That was a true headspin in the business world, known in Europe, in parentheses, for a long time. We as directors have been responsible for stakeholders, but here in the US, it was shareholders until this point. And then that was followed very rapidly by Larry Fink, as Beth highlighted, who then declared that, our responsibility is an intrinsic link between risk and success and commitment to addressing climate change, and really making investments now for the long term. So huge statements from really influential bodies that were catalysts for change. What we've then seen, and so there's the push and the pull as to how real is it. The pull is then this massive shift of institutional funds into managed assets that are associated with sustainability, 124% increase in the last 2 years going into sustainability funds. That's the carrot. The stick is those same institutional investors are about to vote the nom and gov chairs off the board, and or disinvest in assets that companies that aren't taking ESG seriously. So a catalyst followed by a real carrot and a stick says we have to take this seriously. Where the companies are in terms of that imperative varies massively. And so to the question, Karen, around sort of how critical is the board's role, one can characterize the board's role as at least in two different dimensions. If a CEO gets it, and a CEO gets up in the morning and understands triple bottom line, or profits with a purpose, or really committed to sustainability for any reason, intrinsic or extrinsic, the CEO's job is to continue to look round corners, saying, are we doing enough? To the point around incentives. if you're mature enough that the ESG is embedded in the strategy, then how do we really lead the charge? And that's where incentives really comes into play. There are many more boards, I think, today, particularly if you're not in the oil and gas and utilities space, where the CEO hasn't got it yet. They're still focused on profits, and they're sort of paying lip service to it. The board's role there is to basically insist that it has airtime at the board. And so there's a responsibility to make sure that there is oversight and discussion and challenging of management at the committee level and at the board level. And yet again, to look around the corners and saying, how are we doing relative to others, including vis-a-vis employees? And so the case for ESG came from outside. The case for corporations now is also from employees, because if you don't have a purpose, it's unlikely you're going to be able to attract this next generation of really talented folks entering the workforce. So we have a critical role as directors in multiple dimensions. And whether you're talking about the role of strategy, governance, CEO management, succession, or risk management, embedding the ESG lens into each and every one of those is what the board needs to do. Does it come, how often is it embedded into compensation? Biggest challenge is measuring it, and measuring it in a way that makes it both meaningful and doesn't create unintended consequences. And so whether it is a D&I metric, if you say I want 50% of my executive team women, there's a risk that you create quotas and lots and lots of downside from that really positive dimension. So Karen, I'm just not seeing a huge uptake in ESG metrics yet. At best, it is a modifier. You're expecting your executives to not only deliver the financial results, but they also need to make progress, either against qualitative or quantitative metrics. But I think we're still a long way from having a comprehensive, comparable set of metrics for ESG writ large or D&I that means that I am going to stand up and advocate and say everybody should be measured. It's a step we should take carefully.
Yeah, I think my experience is the early days on that, on the linking to comp across the company. So we do have a question from the audience, and I'm going to read the question. So any one of you can, any one of the panelists can raise their hands. The question is, can you please share perspective on public company boards versus private company boards, and how the approach may be different to find these opportunities? Now, I'll also let know that the asker of this question, Sylvia has told us that this is going to be a topic for a future session in January, but I think we can still, since we have a participant who asked the question, we can still touch on it briefly. Anybody? Yeah, Roberta, you want to comment on that?
Sure. So it really doesn't matter, quite frankly. It is really very much the same process, in the sense that you need a board bio, you need a board resume, and you need your LinkedIn to match. The process may be a little less formal with a private company, and again, it depends on the age and stage. I've sat on, at this point, probably 11 different boards, going from startups, which are very loosely structured, all the way to very large private company boards. And all of my boards, by the way, right now are private companies. One just announced that it's going to go public via SPAC. This was a week ago Monday, so it's now public. But I'm more than happy to talk more about how it works. But it is the same process. It's the networking, and it is the process of speaking with people who might know of an opportunity where you can add value, and that's super important. The other thing I always think about when I think about boards is that it's almost like prom. If any of you had a prom when you were in high school, you have to be all ready and signal that you'd be willing to be asked. But you can't be desperate or you're not going to get asked. So the coaching that I got early on was, you've got room for one more board. Even if you had room for 2 or 3, you've got room for one more, because you have to look, interesting and interested. But the process really isn't that different in terms of a private company versus a public company.
Thanks, Roberta. Anybody else want to have any different perspectives? Jill, yeah?
Yeah, and not a different perspective at all. I think spot on. But I think my experience is that private companies are much more likely to be looking for very specific industry, sector, functional expertise, because most private companies have investors, whether they're VC or private equity. Most boards are therefore predominantly the investors, and they'll look for 1, 2, 3 independents. And generalists, it's harder to find a role for generalists. They're looking for somebody that's done it at scale. Whereas public boards, because of all of the cross currents of the demands that we've been talking about, in some ways, it's easier to find a fit if you don't naturally belong in a sector that allows you to single-handedly, single-mindedly focus on that sector opportunity.
Great. So I'm going to ask Beth this question from the audience. It's a question really about how many boards are too many? And you can share your own experiences, but also some of the other, the ways the companies look at this.
So I think the answer is it depends. So I think if one is working full-time and doing boards, I think that's viewed in a certain light. If one has decided to retire from an operating role and just focus on boards, you know, the rule of thumb is depending on one's role on the board, I don't think you can chair more than 4 audit committees, but you can be on more than 4 public boards, but you have to be mindful of what your role is on that board, on each board collectively. I wanted to add on to the prior comment about private, to what Jill and Roberta just said. It's difficult to be in that place where you've got investors and independents because the incentives and what people want out of it are really different. It's really a transition moment that can sort of last for a long time since the boards don't meet very often. So my experience is the best private companies are run like public company boards and begin to do so with rigor over time. The other thing that I wanted to mention that came up at a dinner last week was one of the hardest things about this whole thing is the waiting. The boards only meet 4 times a year, maybe a little bit more with COVID and depending what's going on M&A. But you know, what one's candidacy might be viewed as, given the specific mission of the Nom-Gov committee, bringing to the board 4 times a year, that it could be a long time before you hear back. And it's hard to wait and not pressure, but to the points that were made, if you look desperate, it's not going to help you. So it's really a lesson in resilience and you know, control, but it's really an important lesson because just the wrong approach, the wrong word, the wrong question could just mean the difference between making it and not making it.
Thanks. And I just mentioned that there are a number of programs that people can get into, like I mentioned, the Deloitte Center for Board Effectiveness, where they actually do mock interviews, which I think the participants that I've been involved with have found to be super helpful because, you know, practice is useful all the time, right? So, and particularly if you've been in your position for quite some time, it's probably been a long time since you interviewed for anything, right? Because you've been at the company for a while, and so it can be a good non-threatening way. And you know, you can do that yourself. You can ask somebody you know that's a board member to say, listen, will you conduct a mock interview with me? And you know, frankly, in the Deloitte program, they say make sure that your feedback is brutal. You say, oh, gee, I don't like to be brutal, but but it's helpful, right?
It's a really good point because practice builds confidence and confidence builds competence.
Exactly. And you learn to shorten up your answers, and you learn to don't, you know, make sure you make a note so that you answer the question that you're asked, right? Because you're only going to have so much time. So we got a few more questions. I'm going to quickly, we only have a couple minutes, but I want to ask Roberta. Roberta, you have got such immense experience in an area that's a really super hot space right now. And how are you seeing boards being involved in the return to office discussion, hybrid versus not? And then maybe taking it further, how can boards be catalysts for reimagining the future of work and the physical use of space and footprints? Just quickly.
Yeah, quickly. This is a really big topic. Well, first of all, thank you for saying return to office as opposed to return to work, because it really irks people when they say, oh, it's return to work, where everybody's been working at maximum speed, maybe even more so during this pandemic. So I'll take it in four pieces here. So there's one, which is workforce preferences. The second point I'll touch on is workplace and building safety. The third is workplace design. And then the fourth is sort of the workforce management, which is kind of the people side. So really quickly, in terms of the workforce preferences, COVID changed everything. I mean, we've been talking about the demise of the office since the fax machine. For those of you who are older on this call, there was a time when there was no fax and there was no email. And so the when and where people can work and work effectively has really changed. This has been a forced experiment, which has proven to be very successful and has changed what people want. And going back to Deloitte, I read a recent report where 61% of millennials and 57% of Gen Z prefer video conferencing instead of coming in or traveling. So it is going to be imperative for us to understand workforce preferences and to understand that the space and time equation has really changed. It used to be a perk. Can I work from home today or on Fridays? It's no longer a perk. Now it's going to be part of the equation. The second piece is around building safety. And it's a big question. It is a really big question to understand what is going to make people feel safe. Is it contactless entries and elevators? Is it going to be monitoring indoor air quality? I mean, before, when you looked at a lease, it would be, we're going to provide temperatures between this and that in the summer and this and that in the winter. Now it's going to be about indoor air quality too. We knew it was important before. We knew about sick buildings, but now it's there in a huge way. I'm not sure I'm ever going to put a candle on a cake and have somebody blow on it and then serve it to everybody ever again. So I think that's the second thing. The third is really around work spaces. And again, one size does not fit all here. So we're going to need heads down space, collaboration space, teaming spaces. And it's not going to be all heads down space will do that at home, because there are people who've got little kids, or there are people who have 3 roommates, and they're going to want heads down space in a work office, in a place where they can come to. And so there's this tension here between the opportunity to cut cost and cut footprint, along with trying to figure out how do we deliver the right space on the right day for the people who need it. It's going to be like this huge game of Tetris. And again, some of my prop tech companies are trying to really figure this one out. This code has not been cracked yet. And it's not going to be as simple as, oh, just reserve a spot. And I think that the WeWork mode, the WeWork company failed, but I think the WeWork model of flexibility, I think, is a reality. And the last is the human element. And one of the things that I think, if companies are just focusing on the physical changes to the workplace, or they're just focusing on, safety-driven elements, I think they're going to miss something. One of my companies, as I said, Kiavi, is now remote first, which means that they just hired a chief risk officer in Nebraska. We've got nobody else in Nebraska, but COVID has given us an opportunity, and being remote first has given many companies the opportunity to find talent wherever it is and to embrace it and include it. And so I think this is another opportunity. However, it presents a new opportunity. This new opportunity presents a challenge, which is how do we bring these people in? How do we include them? If we've got 6 people in the room, 3 people on the Zoom, how does that work? How do we not have a second-class citizen? How do we make sure that those people who are less visible are still available and considered for promotion, for assignments, for development? And so these are big challenges. So I would say for boards and for companies that are thinking we're going to go back to 2019 and start bringing people back into a workspace the way we used to and do things the way we used to are going to miss a huge, huge opportunity, both in terms of what the workforce wants and what the workspaces need to be. So there's a lot of work here to be done. I don't know that I've answered all the questions, but I've certainly raised some of them, and there are plenty more, but I wanted to just sort of touch on what's really going on in that area.
Thanks, Roberta. I think you can probably plan on another webinar in your future on this particular topic, since it's such a hot topic. Well, we're out of time. And I just wanted to mention, I don't know if folks saw it, but yesterday PwC US announced that they will be virtual. They are not going to require their people to come back because they had a survey, 65% of the people said they were looking for jobs, which is not a good number. And they realized that they're not going to be able to keep their people. So it's, I think, exactly what Roberta said. So I want to thank all of the panelists, Beth, Jill, Jen, and Roberta. Thank you so much. And I think Sylvia or maybe Christy is going to put us into breakouts, I think, right?
Yeah, so we have Emily from ACG who's actually organized everyone. So the way we're going to structure it is each of the panelists will have a breakout room, and we've just randomly selected the attendees to go into each of those rooms for the final half an hour of the event. If you end up in a room and there's really one speaker you wanted to be with, just come back to the main room and we'll plop you into the other room so we can easily move you around. So we'll just give Emily 1 second to make sure that she's able to align all the speakers in the right spaces, and then you'll get an invite requesting you to accept an invite to join one of the breakout rooms.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. You guys did a great job.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's give us 1 more minute. Apologies for the delay.